Hello there. My name is Timothy Hampton. I'm the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome to today's Berkeley Book Chat. The Berkeley Book Chats feature a member of the UC Berkeley Arts and Humanities community discussing recent work with a colleague. Today we're very happy to welcome Professor David Henkin of the Department of History, talking about his new book, The Week, a history of the unnatural rhythms that made us to who we are. He'll be in conversation with Professor Elisa Tamarkin of the English department. Before I turn things over to our guests today, let me say a word about upcoming events. Next week, we'll be welcoming Professor Edward Tyerman of the Department of Slavics to talk about his new book, International Aesthetics, China and Early Soviet Culture. He'll be in conversation with Andrew Jones. And I remind all of you grant seekers out there that on February 11th, we will be co-hosting an event with Margaret Guerrero and David Siegfried of the Foundation Relations and Corporate Philanthropy at Berkeley on how to get grants for support of research in the humanities. That will be at noon on February 11th, so mark that one down. Feel free to consult our website for a full calendar of events sponsored through the Townsend Center. As we turn now to today's event, let me remind you that our guests will speak for about 3/4 of an hour, and then the floor will be open to questions from the audience. So please use your chat function to transmit your question. Now it's my great pleasure to turn things over to Lisa and David. Welcome to the Townsend Center.
Thank you, Tim. It's so good to be here to talk with David about his marvelous book, The Week, A History of the Unnatural Rhythms That Make Us Who We Are, about the 7-day week's tenacious grip on modern consciousness. Now, there's nothing new about the fact of the week. It's as old as the idea of the Sabbath in which it's anchored. But this timekeeping unit has maintained its hold on us and continues to shape our lives, though it isn't observable in nature in the way, for example, that months can be tracked in lunar cycles. And this makes the week problematic since it doesn't fit neatly into months and it doesn't fit neatly into a year either, because a year isn't strictly divisible by 7. But then every historical effort to tweak the calendar so that 7-day weeks fit into the year with just one blank day left over, and so that every annual day would correspond consistently to a single day of the week, so that maybe the first day of spring could always begin on Monday. Every attempt, that is, to reform the 7-day week in accordance with nature failed. We are very committed to our week and to the marking of each of the days of our week, even though the week is finally unnatural and actually pretty awkward, and even though it means, in David's words, that weeks bounce around the monthly and yearly units that ostensibly contain them. The book is about the strange, unnatural endurance of the week, and about how a sense of attunement to the rhythms of the week intensifies in the 19th century US, so that while the week itself is very old, its 7-day rhythms came to tick louder around this time and to mark a particularly modern form of consciousness. And what came to be felt more meaningfully and even fatefully was not just the work week as distinct from the weekend, but the distinctiveness of each day of the week, call it a phenomenology of Monday or of Tuesday, an increasing awareness of 7 distinctive days and qualitative differences among the days, even the astrological significance of certain days. And while David claims that rationalists may dismiss such claims to day specialness and difference as insignificant, we're no such rationalists here, because today is Wednesday. And Wednesday, of course, matters to us because we all know it to be the Townsend Book Chat Day. We always know it's Wednesday in a college because this day means to us teaching or else not teaching, or maybe a committee meeting or a cappella rehearsal or vegan night at the co-op. Wednesday was, in fact, a ceremonial day in college life in the 19th century, always at Harvard the day of convocations and commencements, commencement Wednesday. And in fact, one of the arguments of David's book is that our sense of weekliness increased with compulsory education and also educational reform, so that to attend school is to inhabit a world in which weeks made a difference. Of course, in high school, I twice dressed as Wednesday Addams for Halloween because I tended to be a sullen teen. And we all know that Wednesday's child is full of woe. Though I was actually born on a Saturday, which then fully explains why, as Saturday's child, I work hard for my living, whereas Friday's child is just loving and giving. Wednesday is the day Thoreau dedicates to friendship in his book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, which is also a book of mourning about his lost friend, his brother, Wednesday being both the center and the climax of a book, which, as David might put it, suggests an upward slope between Sunday and Wednesday, and then a deep downward slope back to Sunday. We learned from David's book that in antebellum America, Wednesday also happened to be specific to baking pies. Finally, I've heard David say that his favorite day is Wednesday, and he can tell us why, while telling us how much social and cultural work went into producing the 7-day rhythms we now take for granted, and how powerfully those rhythms came to beat. So, David, I thought maybe we could start where you begin in your book, which is with reflections on what it meant to finish the book during the pandemic, when we tended to lose track of days, and when every day becomes Blur's Day. You begin with a reflection on what it means to lose track of time. So let's begin there, and then we'll move on from there.
Okay. First, thank you for that great summary response to the book. So I wrote this book. I researched the book pretty much entirely before. So in case other people lost me too. So it softened my sense of the imminent unraveling of the week. I actually took the fact that everyone was complaining about Blur's Day to signify that despite some significant changes in weekly rhythms over the last 20 years, involving things like telecommuting or asynchronous entertainment, that in fact people still did cling to the week as a kind of anchor of their place in time. And the reason I thought that was because it didn't seem to me obvious why the pandemic shutdown would have specifically unsettled the weekly calendar. I mean, there are many other aspects of our calendar that seem to me more dramatically unsettled, especially the difference between day and night. And then the annual calendar as well. And people do sometimes talk about, this March of 2020 went on for whatever, 267 days, whatever it was. So people did talk a little bit about it, but almost all the time when people wanted to say that they had no sense of the passing of time, they expressed it in terms of their not knowing what day of the week it was. Even though it wasn't always obvious why working from home would necessarily help make it harder to distinguish Tuesdays from Wednesdays. I mean, there are some, we could talk about that if you want, but finishing this book during the shutdown reinforced my sense that for people today and still today, the week really is a kind of symbol of being anchored in time, and especially a symbol as well as an instrument of our ability to remember time. So much of what I learned about the modern week in doing this research reinforced a suspicion that I had, but wasn't sure about, that the week is uniquely and powerfully connected to human memory, which is one of the reasons why when we forget what day of the week it is such a singular symptom of disorientation and even of cognitive decline. It's not only that it's going to make us miss appointments, it's that if we can't remember what day of the week it is, it seems like maybe we're losing a grip on all the things that depend exclusively on human memory.
That's great. And you do so much in the book with diaries, where people have what you describe as a kind of temporal location where they lose track of the day and then they try to regain the day. And it's great. And I want to get to the diaries. But before we get to the diaries, one of the questions, or the main question that you ask in the book, is how attuned Americans were to the 7-day cycle in the 19th century. So it makes sense to ask you first, given how old the idea of the week, the fact of the week is, at least a week that is rounded around a Sabbath day, why you've centered the book on a particularly American moment in the 19th century. Why, in other words, Americans, and also why the 19th century? What happens?
Okay.
What happens to the week? Then,
Right.
I mean, why would that be the focus?
Right. So this is a great question because I think that is the most bizarre and counterintuitive argument or move that I'm making here, is I'm saying that a very, very old technology that didn't structurally change at all, and was subject to none of the sort of mechanical innovations or even political pressures that we associate with the 19th century, nonetheless came to exert its current function then. So, and maybe this is a way to answer both questions. The United States in 1800 was actually a distinctively week-oriented society compared to other societies that, let's say, in the 18th century cared about the week. So in a way, I'm choosing America because that would seem to be the hardest place to show that the week changed in modern life, because the week was already a very powerful calendar then. So why was it a very powerful calendar? And then why do I think it changed? So it was a very powerful calendar then because Sunday, I do think, was more widely observed in more different ways in the United States in the early years of the Republic, and also in the late years of the colonial period, largely for religious reasons. In other words, both colonies that were founded by Puritan Sabbatarians and colonies that were not, nonetheless were fairly attached to the idea of the Sabbath, and all of the saints' days and feast days that were observed in Catholic Europe or in Eastern Orthodoxy or even in the Anglican Church didn't survive the transatlantic passage. I mean, some of them were deliberately, notably stripped, and others just seem to have disappeared. So if you lived in Europe in the 18th century, the question of whether it was a Tuesday wasn't always as important as the question of what date of the month it was, because there were so many Gregorian occasions. In addition, let's just take England as the comparison. In 17th, 18th century England, there were all kinds of historical commemorations, some of which have been grafted upon earlier Catholic feasts and fast days. But those too were gone by the period of the Revolution, because anything that commemorated an event in English history was no longer a national holiday. So in 1800, Sunday really does stand out as a sort of a kind of oasis or island or prison or whatever in time for all kinds of people. And people don't work on Sundays in the United States in 1800 at much higher rates than anywhere else, so far as we can tell. So again, in a way, I'm starting in the 19th century to show that even where the 7-day Sabbath week, what I call the Dominical week, is fully in place, something hasn't yet happened. And what hasn't yet happened is that most people don't have lives where their Tuesdays are really different from their Wednesdays. And so their attachment to that weekly calendar is largely confined to the question of distance from or relationship to Sunday. That's still a big deal. I mean, many of our feelings about the week today still have to do with its proximity to or relationship to the weekend. But we have this other thing, which is that we are really attached to the significant differences between consecutive days, which also has a long history. I mean, the whole idea of a planetary week, from which we derive all the names of the days of the week in English and in most Indo-European languages, rather than numbering them, asserts that every day is in some irreducible, unquantifiable way different from the one that comes before and after it. So that's an older tradition, but do people really care whether it's Tuesday or Wednesday in the 18th century? And my sense was, the more I looked into it, that they didn't necessarily, and they didn't always remember events as having happened on a day of the week. But in the early 19th centuries, people began urbanizing, going to school. Some of them were receiving weekly wages, engaging in forms of commercial entertainment or voluntary association that almost invariably attached their schedules to the days of the week. It became much harder just to think of a Tuesday or a Wednesday as a weekday. Tuesdays were different from Wednesdays. And therefore, when you remembered stuff in your life or when you were called upon to testify about an event in court, it was very easy to say, well, I don't know what date it was, but this definitely happened on a Wednesday. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's really great how you distinguish in the book between the kind of Sabbatarian week on the one hand, and then what you describe as this astrological week, almost based in these sort of ancient ritualistic, and the sort of back and forth between the two, how both senses of the week, a week that's distinguished both by its week and its weekend, but then a week also that has these distinctive days in which every day counts for something and means something in particular. Were playing off each other, and the kind of rise of that astrological week in the 19th century, where more is planned on each day. I want to ask you, before we talk more about what happens on each day in the 19th century and why that sense of dailiness or weekliness intensifies, I wanted to ask you about this word that is so defining in the book, in the title itself, which is rhythms. You seem to take the word rhythm, at least in part, from what you describe as Durkheim's distinction between measuring time on the one hand and establishing temporal rhythms on the other that are fundamentally social. And then you also turn to other psychologists and phenomenologists in the 19th century who are thinking about different ways of measuring time. But I love the idea of the week as a way of measuring time rhythmically. And just wanted you to talk about rhythm as this all-important word to the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think we use the word rhythm in different ways, and I definitely have different kinds of attachments to it. But I'd say a couple of things. One is, and you can use the word rhythm for much larger time frames, but rhythm seems an especially good word to describe a time where you still feel the reverberations of a previous beat. Right, as opposed to, you can talk about the rhythms of the year or the rhythms of history, but the rhythms of a week suggest that each beat, kind of as in music, shapes the perception of the beats that follow. So I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in the way the week provides different kinds of rhythm. It's easier to describe the distinction that I'm making with the word rhythm, which is a week has a bimodal rhythm, what you might think of as a tick and a tock of the on days and the off days. It has this 7-part rhythm, which each one is different. I compare it to a scale, like the do re mi fa sol la ti, right? And then it also has a different kind of rhythm where each week is its own unit, right? Where you think, weeks have gone by, right? So the week as a whole, in some ways, has a beat, and then the next one has a different kind of beat. The word rhythm helps me sort of describe the what I see as a crucial distinction in the different structural things that a week does. Because so many people in the modern world and so many historians and scholars assume that all a week does is the tick-tock thing, it, I think, made it harder to see what changed in the 19th century. It's also made it harder to see why it is that we are so attached to the week psychologically, mnemonically, in moments like the pandemic shutdown. So those are most of the things I think I get out of the word rhythm. The other thing I would say is that we tend to think of modern time, or scholars have described modern Western time as linear, and imagine pre-modern or non-modern time as cyclical or circular. And I think rhythm kind of gets us a little bit out of that dichotomy. It is definitely a non-linear thing, which is partly what I want to stress, that this very, very modern timekeeping unit isn't linear at all. But cyclical, circular, and don't strike me as quite the. I mean, Eviatar Zubavel has written, I think, the most famous and important and influential book about the week. Calls it the 7-day circle, and it is a circle, but I actually think that the word rhythm and beat, which I learned recently, was actually what he wanted for his title. He wanted to talk about beat. And the publisher didn't like that. I forget why. But I get why he wanted that title, because circle isn't quite right.
Right. And I mean, you also talk about some of these rhythms are externally imposed, but then so many of the rhythms are internal, right? They're personal associations that we have with days of the week that then imbue that day with its own characteristic, or you describe it as its own physiognomy, right? The physiognomy of a Monday or physiognomy of a Tuesday. But so much of those rhythms are these internal rhythms that are our own adapting to forms of keeping time and scheduling that are then structured from the outside, whether it's through work or through forms of association, social life, recreation.
Right. I mean, I would make a distinction. Sorry.
Yeah, no, go.
I would make a distinction, though. They're both personal in the sense that we experience them internally, but they're also personal in a different, maybe more superficial sense, which is they're not always coordinated. Now, my Tuesday is not the same as your Tuesday, and that's another big feature of the scheduling week. What I'm arguing is, in the 19th century, the week as a scheduling device emerges, and unlike the Dominical Sabbatarian week, and also unlike the astrological week, there's no necessary assumption that the day means the same thing for everybody or every community or even any community. It just means that individuals need to track the days of the week because their lives will accumulate associations with each weekday that are distinctive.
So can you talk about where you went in the archive here is remarkable. Can you talk about where you went to find, to discover the ways in which the sense of weekliness intensifies in the 19th century? I mean, let's bracket diaries to start, because I want to talk more about diaries. But can you talk about some of the places you went? I can mention menus, for example, but my favorite example was actually pawnshop ledgers. So talk about some of these places: newspapers, court reports, wherever you choose. How did you realize the ways in which the week intensifies during this period? Where did you go?
This is the crazy thing about the week. Every book that's written about 19th century U.S. social or cultural history is talking about people who have weekly schedules. And sometimes they mention them in passing, and more often they don't. So all of the evidence that we use to learn anything about ordinary people's what we call daily lives can show us whether their daily lives were in fact the same from one day to the next. So the key thing that I decided to do with this book is to take a long time to research it, knowing that every book I picked up, every source I happened to look at for this or for any other purpose was a potential source. And that's what I did. So, I'd read a book about pawn shops. I mean, pawn shops is not a great example because I kind of knew that pawn shops would be likely. But, you read a book about capital punishment, and then you realize, I wonder if the executions that declined between 1800 and 1850, whether they happened to be on a particular day of the week. You can find that out, right? Or I would the menu is another good example, or school diaries or school catalogs. One thing I did was an obvious thing was you pick up a city directory, and I picked up city directories for a bunch of cities. I chose a few cities that I thought would be representative, and just look at what organizations existed in a particular decade and when did they meet, right? Look at newspapers and just notice whether they have sections or features that appear on a weekly basis. Look at newspapers and figure out when they published. Theater
Oh,
schedule.
and it's actually great. I mean, I always think of the daily paper, the kind of rise of the daily paper in the 19th century, but you make a really compelling argument that the weekliness of papers remained even more important, especially in more rural areas where postal delivery systems, schedules, made the kind of occasion of the arrival of the newspaper during the course of the week an occasion, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's an example of something that I knew I was going to find. I mean, that's something that struck me in my research on a previous book about mail service, where I was actually early on really interested in urban users of the mail. When I started looking at rural, I realized, okay, well, there's this huge thing going on. There's a lot of them have once a week mail service. So whatever newspaper they're reading, or whatever, anything that they're reading that comes from the outside, is attached to a weekly schedule. So there were some things that contributed to my suspicion that this was a worthwhile topic to pursue in the first place, and that would be one of them. But others I hadn't thought about, like I would say theater and the mail and print culture. I had thought about the other things like school or housekeeping became much more important as I.
Wait, so tell us about the domestic manuals and what does housekeeping have to do with the week?
Well,
in the 19th century.
I think of housekeeping as at the vanguard of an industrial use of the week to organize, rationalize, and render more productive work tasks by allocating specific weekdays to do so. So industrialization is a big issue here because in a way, the week itself has an industrial logic. I mean, the Sabbatarian week, already, the biblical expressions of this calendar are fundamentally industrial in their logic, right? It's the temporal segregation of work and something that's not work, whether it's rest or leisure. Okay.
And also the rise of wages, right?
Okay, so I'm gonna get back to wages. So because wages don't have to be paid by the week, and that it has a slightly different set of implications. But so the week is already industrial, but for the most part, industrial employers in the 19th century didn't really use the week to make internal distinctions. They used the week to bracket off week from weekend. They used it dominically. But there were some workspaces that did early on. School would be one. But in some ways, the most strikingly industrial one was the middle-class household, which emerged as a certain kind of workspace. And often, historians describe it as a non-industrial workspace or as like this sanctified counterpoint to the industrial workplace. But in fact, the domesticity guides and authors like Catherine Beecher said, if you want to turn domestic service into a real profession, which is what she wanted, here's how you do it. You don't just do chores whenever. You wash on Monday, you iron. Actually, she thought you should wash on Tuesday, but most of them said wash on Monday, iron on Tuesday. And then there were some disagreements about what you do the rest. They all agree, though, that the week must be used as a sort of managerial technology for organizing domestic service, both paid and unpaid. Now, the wage thing is a little bit different. The wage is system neither just reinforce the weekday-weekend distinction. Nor did it assign different tasks to different days. You got paid on Saturday, typically Saturday night, and then what happens is that you had like a steadily depleting access to resources. So it did make Monday and Tuesday different from each other, but in a kind of quantitative way, right?
And can you tell us how this relates to the pawnshop ledgers?
Okay, so pawnshop ledgers generally showed that people would try to liquidate their pawnable goods, which are typically were clothes, when they ran out of money, and then they would redeem them when they had money. That makes sense. There are other reasons why you might want your special clothes on Sunday anyway. But the main thing was that if you get paid in wages and you've less and less money over the course of the week, what other institutions will give you access to liquidity? And the answer is the pawnshop. And the pawnshop then it has its own 7-day rhythm that tracks that of the wage week, but creates different kinds of special days. Right? The special day when everyone suddenly has their clothing back, or the special day when suddenly everyone has enough cash to go to the saloon.
And so let's talk about diaries too, since they're such an important part of the book. One of the things that I found so fascinating, it kind of blew my mind in thinking about it in relation to your topic, is the invention in the 19th century of the pre-formatted diary, the pre-formatted calendar, like the ones we always used to, schedulers, like the ones we always used to carry around with us. I'm thinking of this as a radical innovation in American bookkeeping at the time. And the fact that these pre-formatted diaries focused around the week, or even when they were left blank, that they were actually spaces to fill in and remember the day of the week. So could you just tell us a little about the diaries you looked at and what you found about tracking the week,
okay, so,
and also losing track, right?
Right. So much of the book, especially as one of the parts of, I guess, part 3 of the book, is really about diaries, and diaries in a couple of ways. Diaries are the best evidence we have of what people did on a daily basis. I mean, I can show in part of the book what their schedules could have looked like, if they belonged to this Lyceum lecture or if they took French classes or whatever. But the diaries is where we see what they actually did. So I turned to the diaries first and foremost, try to figure out whether people weekly lives had certain kinds of rhythms, and I learned some things and was frustrated not to learn other things. But the other thing is that the diary itself was a huge event in the history of tracking the week, because ordinary people used it increasingly on a massive scale to think about their own calendars, and they created these calendars for themselves that they use sometimes as a sort of like appointment books, but mostly they use them as what you call bookkeeping, as kind of like an account book. So the mere fact that people were keeping diaries and that diaries either said what day of the week it was on each day, or that they chose to record the name of the day, as they almost universally did by the middle of the 19th century, is huge evidence for weekly time consciousness. But the form of the diary also changed. So pre-formatted calendars in the 18th century were typically almanacs, and almanacs privileged the month. Right? Almanacs arrayed days and pages of months, and to the extent that they left room for you to make annotations or keep accounts, they were at the end of or in the beginning of a month. Or if you wanted to interleave pages, you would have to interleave them between months. So it's all about the months. And we're familiar with that. Our wall calendars, toward, let's say, 20th century wall calendars, also foreground the month, month of the view. But in the second quarter of the 19th century, the pre-formatted pocket diary became a mass consumer good. It had been created earlier in the 18th century and it bombed. It went nowhere. But in the second quarter of the 19th century, it was revived, and suddenly there was a mass market for it, and it became a popular consumer good. And the pocket diary, if we were home, I would show you one. But like lots, actually, hold on. Oh no, right. Tended to array about 7 days at a time. Some of them actually showed you a full week. Some of them showed you 6 days and put the Sundays in the back, or some of them showed you 6 days and let it migrate. But it turned what we can call a circa septon rhythm or period into the standard view. So anyone who used one of these diaries was forced in some way to think about things happening around every 6 or 7 days. So that's a huge change that we can tell. You don't even have to read people's diaries; just note how common these were and look at the print runs for these things. But I actually spent a lot more time with blank diaries that didn't condition people necessarily to see the week as a central timekeeping calendar, but nonetheless gave people opportunities to mark time as they saw fit. And one of the things I got most excited about was tracking their errors, figuring out when someone. Because you don't really, if someone says something happened on Wednesday, February 2nd, you don't really know unless the diary is pretty detailed and writes every day whether the person's actually right about what day it is. But when they make an error, in other words, when they say Wednesday, February 3rd, and there's no such date, and you have to figure out which one is right. I was struck by, maybe not surprised by, but struck by. Overwhelmingly, the day is correct and the date is wrong. Sometimes you're alerted to it by the fact that they themselves make the correction. And also you're alerted to it when the mistake happens the other way and they talk about it. It's like a big deal. They never say, oh, I thought it was the 27th and it turned out to be the 26th and it caused this problem. But when they lose track of the day, they will often talk about it. And it often is, most of the occasions I found where someone lost track of the day as well as, or instead of the date, it was during a moment of being dislodged from routines. Someone traveling exceptionally in Saratoga Springs, someone traveling in Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, someone taking an overnight boat from Albany to New York and then looking for a job and being all stressed and is blown away by the fact that he has the day of the week wrong the week, and then to reconstruct his error. He figured, oh, I counted this night and not that night. So diaries become this great place for people not only to construct their calendars, but also to comment on calendars. So diaries were really, I spent a lot of my time looking at diaries for all kinds of purposes, and they're great. But yeah.
It's really important that when memory lapses, people tend to remember the day and not the date. And this is something that comes out in the evidence you provide of court reports also, where the testimony from a witness would remember the day on which a crime happened, but not necessarily the date, right? That what lodges as our memory is where that event spatially occurs during the course of the week, and we hold on to that particular day. David, could you tell us, one of the, there's a really moving account when you're describing the diaries of a father who is mourning his daughter and choosing when to mourn his daughter. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah.
Because it says a lot about days and dates. Versus
so this is less about memory in the sense of not forgetting. It's about memory and commemoration. Right. Parents lose a child tragically, and on the first anniversary of the death, there's a dilemma, which I guess we all face when we think about anniversaries of events. Anniversaries strictly should be the same date, but the same date the next year, or even 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years afterwards, is not going to be the same day of the week. So they debate. They don't feel right celebrating commemorating the anniversary on a Friday if she passed away on a Thursday, or it might have been reversed, I forget now. But they don't want to move the date, and they think about it. In the end, they decide, no, we're gonna mark her death on the day of the week when it happened, because it just doesn't seem to us like the same day. And I actually have friends also who associate their parents' death with the day of the week in which it happened, rather than the culture of annual commemoration is its own hugely interesting subject that I would love to read, but probably not write a book about it, but certainly sort of visceral proximate experiences dispose us to want to sort of have the day of the week match as well. And again, it's not about forgetting. It's about commemoration and re-experience. Yeah.
Right, re-experience and how a day becomes meaningful, right? And the attachment to that particular day of the week. So there's some questions, but before I start to read the questions, I just want to ask you one more thing. You describe all of these revolutionary efforts to get rid of the 7-day week during the French Revolution, during the Russian Revolution, to create weeks of different lengths and different intervals, a 5-day week, a 6-day week, either in accordance with nature or for reasons having to do with labor and productivity. And all of these revolutionary efforts to reform the week fail. So I just wanted you to speak to that a little and tell us why.
Okay,
well,
so
first of all, what they are and why.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief because I know there are questions, but one way to think about it is the Enlightenment, Marxism, and Western capitalism all have a huge problem with the 7-day week. They all assault it with all of their might and force, and they all fail. So that, you can sort of just leave it at that and know there must be something. But I actually think that there's a little bit of a slightly different explanation for each one, or a different sort of shade to each one. The French revolutionary attempt to create a more rational 10-day week, which was of a piece with all the other sort of decimal reforms that they proposed and successfully introduced in much of the world, is really an assault on religion, and I think largely fails because it is an assault on religious practices that people don't want to. The revolution didn't really have the power to extirpate, and this was a sort of major transition, getting rid of the Sabbath and getting rid of a calendar by which you could calculate Sabbaths and organize liturgical services. So I think that's probably. There's so many sufficient explanations, but that one certainly is sufficient. The Soviet one fails ultimately, I think, because they also wanted it to. They created a 5-day week and then a 6-day week. That is a little bit more about the rhythms of labor, but also the week that the Soviets wanted to introduce was a non-coordinated week. They wanted continuous factory production, so they wanted people to have their weekends staggered, as you might in a workplace that needed continuous labor. And to the best of my reading, that's really what killed it. Other things might have, but I think the larger assault against the power of the clergy in the Soviet Union was far more successful. So that's not a sufficient reason to account for its failure. I think the attempt to create weeks that people didn't share, because a week isn't just about labor. A week is also about people wanting to coordinate their activities and have social rhythms. So that's why it failed. The hardest one to explain is the assault of American big business, because they didn't want to change the length of the week. They didn't want to change its coordinated character. They weren't going to make the week any less useful as a scheduling device, right? They actually were going to leave alone all the things, almost all the things that I say a week was doing in the 19th century. But part of the opposition did come from religions, and if religious Muslims, Christians, and Jews had an extremely difficult time maintaining a 7-day week liturgical or Sabbath calendar that didn't align with the civil secular calendar. So that a lot of options did, but lots of non-religious people objected to it as well, because it just seemed wrong to imagine that there could be a day that has no weekly value. all that the capitalists want, all that the Kodak Corporation and the reformers wanted to do was to say, let's have a blank day at the end of the year. It'll make things so much more convenient, especially for business and accounting. But people balked at the idea that you can have any discontinuity in the weekly count. And again, we understand why religious people would feel that because the continuity of the religious count represents something either historical or just some deontological or something of that sort. But all of us, I think, have come to feel it would be so weird to have a day that wasn't, even though we're used to the fact that holidays sometimes give us shorter work weeks, which is weird in a sort of temporary way. But to actually say that there's a day that is outside the calendar, extra hebdomadal, was a bridge too far for lots of people. And so that's all I have to say in explaining what is in some ways the most mysterious of the three failures.
We don't have an empty, undesignated, unmarked day to do what we want. So there was a question. Could you talk a bit about the 40-hour work week and the rise of overtime?
So that goes back to the question of the industrial week. So the industrial week in the 19th century really is a traditional Sabbath week. In other words, it just says that there are days for work and there are days for non-work. And in the United States, labor unions accept that proposition ultimately, and instead direct most of their energy toward reducing the amount of time that is work week. They focus mostly on the day, on the hours in the day. They also come to later focus on the week. And that is now in the early 20th century, unions made Saturday off a primary goal. But long before they turned to that, they focused on the length of the day, and they typically expressed it in terms of hours per day. The 10-hour day movement, or later the 8-hour day movement. So whether a work week is 40 hours or 48 hours or 60 hours, I don't think fundamentally changes the structure of the week, and so I guess lies outside the bounds of what I was looking at in this book. But I would largely say that that's really about work time. And interestingly, the labor unions have not actually historically focused as much on shortening the work portion of the week. And in the last, I'd say, 60, 70 years, actually labor unions have not focused as much on reducing time at all. Overtime is a good indicator of that. Unions have prioritized wages over time. Overtime is a way to get more money. It's not really a way to shorten people's work weeks.
And another question from the chat. It's very interesting to talk about the temporality of the week or the rhythm of time, but is there also a spatiality of the week? Do people experience the week as a set of locations?
Yeah, so I mean, my argument would suggest that the answer would be yes, and it would be idiosyncratic. The only exception is this business about the diary. So if in fact people were using the same pre-formatted diary in the 19th century, they would have had a set of spatial associations that were associated with the layout of the page. The reason that I don't think they did is because not all pre-formatted diaries had 7 days on a page. Many of them had 6, and if they had 6, and unless they got rid of Sunday, as some of them did, or clustered the Sunday at the end of the book, as some of them did, most of them didn't. So the days of the week would migrate. So you couldn't really imagine Monday as the upper left part of a 2-page spread. So people's spatial associations would be different. William James, and I talk about this in the book, tried to argue that people who have an innate sense of what day of the week it is, it's because there's something in the perceptible universe. Right? He was committed to the idea that perception of time couldn't be an absolute thing. It couldn't be based on like a body clock. It had to be based on sensory perception. So he was imagining that people have a kind of physical, a set of physical associations. Someone else described each day of the week as having a look, like a physiognomy, and compared it to people's faces that you kind of recognize, but I actually think it's probably far more likely that, as the questioner suggests, people locate time in space that way, in part because it is such a mnemonic device, and a lot of people have spatial spatial memories. Some people's memories, I think, are more oral, AUR. So it may not work that way. But for people who like to remember things by placing them in their mind, either formally or informally in some place, I do assume that a Tuesday has a spot. And then definitely some of us imagine it on some calendar, either maybe a monthly wall calendar that shows the whole month but arrays them in rows, so you might think of them spatially that way, or some other kind of calendar that you use on your computer or that you saw as a kid. So yeah, I didn't find people talking about spatial mnemonics of the week, but I think everything that I learned in this research would make it seem to me very plausible that people with spatial memories have heavily spatial associations with the week.
Along the lines of the comment around William James, I just want to read a line from James talking about his friend who described the characteristic physiognomy of the week. He said, Sunday's distinctive appearance, as was you, was rooted in the sensations caused by the cessation of the city's rumbling and the sound of people's feet shuffling on the sidewalk. On Monday, the weekly laundry generated a pattern of clothes drying in the yard and casting a white reflection on the ceiling. So the associations are that personal, that Monday is about that white reflection on the ceiling cast by the drying clotheslines. And there's a comment in the chat. What's particularly exciting about this story is that it points out the ways in which personal experience can take on in intensity when it encounters the week. There's an old blues song, they call it Stormy Monday, but Tuesday's just as bad. Subjective experience ignores the week in that story. So.
Yeah, no, I definitely think of these things as subjective in one sense of the term, and as idiosyncratic. But I'm equally interested in the fact that they're almost always social. Like we have really idiosyncratic personal associations each day of the week. But when you press someone, there's almost always a schedule, a social habit. It's parental custody schedules, school schedules for sure. Food in the cafeteria schedules. So there's schedules behind all these things, even though we respond to them really, really, really idiosyncratically.
And a question from Stephen Best. Douglas observed that when it came to slaves' birthdays, they seldom come nearer to it than planting time, harvest time, cherry time, springtime, or fall time. Is there evidence of the week breeding a different sense of time consciousness for those who had weak access to the month and the year as calendrical units?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about it in the book, but enslaved people in the United States were very much attached to the week for one obvious reason, which is maybe surprise some of you who don't know this history, is that enslaved people did not work on Sundays. But beyond that, there were when I say didn't work, they didn't work for the slaveholder. They often did their own work on Sundays. There were rituals and routines on Wednesdays. On Saturdays, there were food routines. I saw very, very few Gregorian references in the WPA interviews of formerly enslaved people. I saw many weekly references, including some stuff about superstition. Both African and European descended peoples inherited all kinds of superstitions about lucky and unlucky days of the week to do something. So a lot of that among the formerly enslaved, but also food stuff, social stuff, and even just when telling a story, recollections about what day of the week it was. So I do think there was a high degree of calendrical consciousness among the enslaved that I guess the Frederick Douglass line that Stephen's reminding us of fits in that the Gregorian calendar may actually have been far less available to or significant for enslaved people than for free people in the United States. But the weekly calendar definitely did include the enslaved. Whether it breeds a different attitude toward time, I don't know. I mean, the Gregorian calendar has a kind of linear component as well as a cyclical one. It's less of a rhythm. The weekly calendar is entirely cyclical or rhythmic and not linear. So there are places one could go with that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. Yeah.
So, David, we only have a few minutes left, and I thought maybe we could end where you end, which is a kind of reflection on the future of the week and the fate of the week, particularly in our digital age. One thing that we didn't talk about that you describe compellingly in the book is the fact that the week, as we know it, came very late to certain regions, China and Japan, suggesting that the week is not inevitable. It is not fatal in this sense. There are alternatives to the week in our sense of it. And then you end with this reflection on the digital age, the digital moment that is playing havoc with the rhythms of our work and the rhythms of our rest. And so I just wanted to think more about the future.
Okay, so super briefly, because I'm watching the clock here. The fact that the week came so late, to the examples you give to East Asia, suggests two really sort of opposing conclusions. They're both true. One is, of course, it's completely artificial and not inevitable at all, right? Because all these societies did just fine without counting as a continuous 7-day cycle. On the other hand, the rapidity with which the 7-day week has spread from, let's say, the 1870s until let's say the 1970s, 100 years, to become a global timekeeping system, sort of suggests the opposite, that that the week is extremely compelling, appealing, easy to adopt, or you could say that it just really reflects the power of global capital, and maybe earlier the power of American empire, which is the other reason why one might write a book about the week that focuses on the United States. So yeah, it's not inevitable, but I do think that the fact that it's only recently become a global timekeeping system might be an argument for its strength rather than its fragility. On the other hand, as you point out, there are a lot of things about the digital age, and I go through a bunch of them. I think electronic calendars are really important. And I've written a book that says put so much weight on diaries and scheduling. The fact that human beings play a much diminished role in our scheduling, and that computers don't need the mnemonic utility of the week in order to create a schedule of meetings, might suggest that the week will become less important. And then the other big one, of course, is asynchronous entertainment. The fact that I put a lot of emphasis on the fact that commercial entertainment was quick to adopt the week as a scheduling device. And for many of us who lived in the 20th century, we all remember powerful associations with television schedules and even movie schedules and that. And now we don't. So two things about that. One is, just do keep in mind that spectator sports remain attached to the week, and probably no form of commercial entertainment more powerfully than professional college and even high school football in the United States. So
David, you cut out for me for a second.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes. Last thing I said was just that the response to the pandemic suggests that despite perhaps its decreased utility, people remain completely attached to the week as an anchor for our place in time. Okay, so I think we're at 1 o'clock.
Well, yeah, we're at 1 o'clock. So thank you for anchoring us in this particular Wednesday. It's such a compelling book, pertains to all of us, and makes us think about the rhythm of how we get through every one of these difficult weeks. So thank you.
Thank you, Elisa.
And thanks to everyone who's here.
Thanks to Townsend Center.